So this lesson is about mark making and quality of line, and how your marks and how you create lines add to your personal style within your art. So if you think of when you were young, when you first held a crayon or a pencil, you weren't actually trying to create an entire image. You were only thinking about putting some type of mark down on the piece of paper. And each person's mark is almost as unique as either your handwriting or your fingerprint. Each person makes line and mark differently than the next person, and that's how we have so many very different types of art. Even that they may be depicting the same thing, they may look differently. So types of marks and lines could be dot, point, mark, stippling, horizontal line which runs from left to right, vertical line which runs top down to bottom, diagonal line, curved line, zigzag, curvy, hatched and crosshatched, which we hadn't really talked about yet, but we will get into, handwriting, calligraphy style line, expressive line, mechanical or ruled lines, parallel lines, actual line, implied line, and psychic line. The qualities of marks and lines could be thin, thick, segmented, dotted, dashed, hard-edged, smudged, softened, bleeding, which means it would go right off the page, transparent would be like see-through, opaque, which means you cannot see through it, blended, even or uneven pressure. Types of line drawings: gesture drawing, which mark making is used to capture a movement or expression or an idea. There's not a lot of information in that. Contour drawing is basic outlining of shapes. Sometimes it's used as a precursor to a project just to double check to make sure that your proportion is right and your image is balanced. Structural and mechanical drawings are very, very precise. If you think about architectural drawings or blueprints, things where everything has to be very, very specific. Shade is when you're blending or smudging your line. And hatch and crosshatch. Hatch is when you're using your lines and you have them all parallel, one right next to another, either close together or far apart. And then crosshatched is when you literally just crosshatch or cross the line in some way or fashion. And again, they would be either very, very close together or very, very far apart. And I'm going to show you some images later on to show you how hatched and cross-hatching and all these different ideas look. And stippling is very similar to hatch and cross-hatch, and graffiti. So the element of art we're going to talk about now is value, and value really is the element that describes the lightness and darkness of an object. Value can create space, depth, and texture. So if you look at the image that I included on the value slide, you can see how the sphere, the roundness of the sphere that gets created because of the value, the dark values that are on the bottom, and then the bright light values that are at the top. You can see how the object now looks round, or like it's moving into space. And another thing that helps a lot with the dark shadow that's underneath, it gives you a sense of this is where the sphere is sitting on the tabletop, so you get that sense of where something is. And then the background could either be a wall or it can be outdoor space, but it's very dark space behind the table, so you get this element of how you can see deep into the picture. Not only are you looking at the table, but you're looking at beyond the table as well. And then finally we have the idea of texture. Because the value here looks relatively smooth, you could kind of picture what the ball feels like in your mind. If you were to hold that ball, it kind of feels like either hard plastic or something that's just very, very smooth. This image just gives you kind of a look to see how hatching, cross-hatching, stippling, and mark making can create value. I spoke about it a little bit before, but where you're putting lines and marks together, the closer you'll create your darker tones, and then as you spread them out more, you'll start to create your lighter tones, and where they're very separated, you'll start to get your very, very light or highlighted areas. So hatching is the parallel lines, cross-hatching is where they cross over, like the letter T or letter X. Stippling is the dot making, and then mark making, like I said before, is that kind of random scribbling, but it's controlled, it's advanced scribbling now. The principle of design that we're also going to be looking at for our first project is contrast. And contrast is when you use two opposing elements. For example, light versus dark, smooth versus rough, thin versus thick. And you can see in the example here we have the contrasting text and the contrasting colors. For the first project, you'll have the option of focusing on value, where you're creating subtle changes of color with using your pencil or using your mark making, or you can use contrast, high contrast, by changing out from using pencil to using a black marker against the white paper, give you very high contrast or very opposing looks. So in this image, the artist uses mostly thin line to create the outline of the flower and the information inside the flower. And when you're using quality of line, if you use something like thin line, it can also convey some information about the object itself. For instance, that a flower is very delicate, and so if you use thin, delicate lines, it helps to create the feel for the object that you're drawing. And in this image, the artist used very bold and thick lines, and that kind of helps play with the idea of how, large and strong the elephant is. And the artist actually is using black as their negative space, or if you consider it their paper, and then the white is their line work, or what they added to it. For precise angled lines, you can see in this image that all of the shapes are very clean cut. Every shape is very specific, and all the line work is done very neat and angled, kind of like square or rectangle or triangle. They're very geometric in pattern, and he uses all these different styles of line work to create the entire image of the cat. Whereas if you focused on one area, you wouldn't necessarily see the cat. But when it's all put together, it creates the shape of the cat. The image of this bird is kind of like the cat, where the artist is using line work to create the shape of the actual object. However, here the artist is using curvy organic lines. And what curvy organic lines are just more of like a free-flowing or line work that has more of a nod to nature. If you think about waves, or how a river moves, or how things grow, or vine work, how a vine kind of comes up and twirls around. It kind of has that nod to nature. And here you can see the line work is just more flowing than the previous image that we looked at, and creates a different feel than the other image. In this image, the artist is using mark making, and mark making is like advanced scribbling. If you think back to when you were that younger child making marks and just trying to play around with space, this is very similar to that, except for the fact that now the artist is trying to control where the scribbles go and contain them into creating an image. You can see that because the artist here, one, makes the shape of the pear, and then two, is specifically putting the darker marks in specific areas so you can see value and tone, and so it creates kind of the idea of roundness with those scribbles or advanced marks. Expressive line is more about using line work to convey an emotion or a feeling, kind of telling a story about the image. It's very different than precise and angle lines. You're just trying to get the viewer to have an intense reaction or an intense feeling about the image. So in this image, the expressive line is used to create the female form, and you can see that she's kind of, bending over and her hair is spilling down. And it's a very elegant and kind of sensuous image, even though there's not a ton of information. As far as expressive line goes, the artist isn't necessarily trying to give a realistic approach or even give a lot of information. Instead, the artist is trying to use line to express the idea or express the feeling of the image. So in the beginning we talked a little bit about hatching and cross-hatching. In this image, it's kind of, the idea is put to use. You can see how the shapes were created with line, but not only are the shapes created with line, but all of the information within those shapes are also created with line work. So all of the values in this image are made with hatched lines, which again are lines that are parallel next to each other, and they can run vertical, horizontal, or curved or diagonal. If you look at the trees, those are all hatched lines because they're right next to each other and there's no crossing on them. But if you look to the ground or the path, that's where they really kind of come together and look like lowercase letter T's, where they're crossing at some point. This is a really realistic drawing of a young girl. When you look closely at the image, you can see the hatching and the cross-hatching that make up all of the values on her face and all of the information about the shape. So again, as the line work and the hatching and cross-hatching gets closer together, it creates more depth and creates a darker value. And as the hatching or the cross-hatching start to separate a little bit more, then it'll create a lighter image. Stippling is like hatching and cross-hatching, but instead of using line work to create value, for stippling you use dots. If you look at the back edge of the egg and right underneath the egg, the dots are put very, very close together to create shadow. And on the top of the egg, the dots are spaced out more to create a highlight. Where there are no dots, it creates a very, very strong highlight. In this image, you can see how stippling is used again, but in a more complex form. So instead of just the eggs, it's used to create the portrait. Same concept, close by, creates shadow, farther apart, creates highlight. Implied line is when the artist decides that they don't want the line or outline to be continuous, but instead start and stop it, so that way there's breaks within the line. You can see that in this painting of the mountains, that the artist takes visual pauses in between. As the viewer, we know that the mountain didn't stop existing in that spot, but it continues, but the artist makes it a little bit more interesting to look at instead of just having a bold outline like you would in a coloring book. Psychic line is a tool for an artist to use to make a viewer look around their picture at different points. And what they do is they'll usually set something up to guide the viewer into looking at a specific point, first, second, third, and so on. So as we look at this image, we have the female archer who's pulling back on her bow, who's about to release the arrow. And what that does is, in your mind as the viewer, is you put yourself, okay, she's about to release the arrow, where is the arrow going to go? And you follow the direction of the arrow, and it looks like it's going to kind of the top left corner of the image. So that brings the viewer's eye from the person right below the moon, and then you kind of swing down to the swan. So it kind of creates a little triangle effect. So the artist is giving you very specific points to look at in the image and how to look at them and when to look at them. So next we're going to switch out to a series of specific artists to look at how specific people use line. And I'm going to start with one that is very, very familiar. Everyone knows who Vincent van Gogh is, and everybody knows who Starry Night is. And the reason why I like this image is because you know that, A, he's using expressive line, a lot of line work in the sky as it's kind of swirling around. You can see how the paintbrush creates all those little lines and makes them curve around to create the swirls in the sky, to create the glow around the moon. And then bring your eye back down to the bottom, you can see the curved lines on the mountain, and just all together how he's using lines in a very specific way. So we're looking at a second painting from Van Gogh, and here I want you to notice that even though the landscape has changed, we're no longer looking at a night image as opposed to a day image, the line work that Van Gogh uses is still very similar to the line work that he used in the image that we just looked at. If you look at the cypress trees here in this image, it's very similar to the cypress tree that was in the first image. However, instead of using dark silhouetted colors, he's now using the brighter greens because of the daytime. In the sky, you still have that expressive quality in the clouds, but you start to kind of get away from the very, very specific line work. You can see how he's blending a little bit more in the clouds here, and it just goes to show you how an artist will take line and use it as more of a personal style. And so it transfers from each image that you do, even though you're going to use different ideas within each image. Claude Monet is an Impressionist artist, and you can see that the reason why they called them Impressionists is because they didn't use very, very clear line work. Instead, it kind of had a smudgy effect that in this Water Lilies painting you can see very, very clearly. One of the things you can see is in the wisteria that's kind of curving down from the top of the image on both the left and the right. A very organic looking line. And then you go into all of the swirl and marks that you can see that Monet used to create the water and the reflection of the clouds. Very, very specific to his style, which again we'll pick back up in the next slide. So I wanted to show you haystacks just so you can relate it back to water lilies. Again, very different image. Water lilies, clearly different color scheme, different idea, different object. Haystacks, different lighting, different objects in it. But even though the images are very different, you can still see how the smudgy lines that Monet uses are very specific to him. Georges Seurat is probably the most well-known artist for using pointillism. Couple reasons. One of the things that made him really interesting is all the different values that you see are used almost like a computer graphic, where he's only using a very specific palette of colors and getting shades and tints of those colors by putting like a yellow dot next to a blue dot to create the idea of green, surrounding a yellow dot with lots of blue dots to create the idea of the darker green in the lower corner, putting more yellow dots around the blue dots to create the bright green, to create the sun hitting kind of the riverbank area. So Seurat uses all dots, pointillism, in his images, and sometimes he made the dots very, very close together so that way it gave more of a clean effect. So the further you got away, the more it looked like a realistic image. And then other times he used the dots really large, like you'll see in the next image. So that way you very clearly understood that he was using dots and dots alone. So in this image you can see the dots very clearly for what they are. They're much larger. You can see kind of the color changes within, you know, the tree to the ground to the water, and how even though the water's blue, all of the dots in the water are not always blue. He's using different kind of color within them, and it just gives it a different feeling. It still has the same pointillism idea, but it's just being used in a new way. Paul Cézanne uses kind of a mix of implied line with expressive line. And you see that very clearly in the tree, how the tree is broken up, the lines are segmented, they're not continuous throughout the entire tree. It doesn't look realistic. And then once you look toward the background, again, you see the implication of a continuous mountain form, but if you look really closely, there's breaks within the mountain. Very kind of reminiscent of his style. Very kind of bold line work in the sky. You can see that the sky is not smooth across from left to right, but kind of jagged and crazy in all the different kind of brush strokes that he uses on the right part of the sky, and then kind of in between the branches he's going left to right and up and down. Really kind of exciting lines. You can almost imagine him painting with kind of a excitement or a velocity when he's painting, creating these really crazy lines. So in this image, Cézanne's really kind of calmed down the movement in the line work. The sky especially, you can see it, that the line work's not as erratic and it's not moving in all different directions, but instead all the line work is still moving in the same direction. You can still see all the lines, but they're kind of more cohesive. In the trees and the branches, the trees still feel the same, but they're not as broken up or segmented as the first one. One of the things he could be doing here is, instead of using the broken up line work in the really erratic sky painting piece, he could be showing calmer scenes. So whereas some artists maybe change their line work over time, other artists might change their line work just to depict a different feeling within the painting. So the other kind of painting kind of feels like it might be a really, really windy day or a stormy day, whereas this one feels like a calmer day. Same style of line work, especially within the forms that he makes, but maybe a different feeling in this one. In the next few slides, I want to show you by Piet Mondrian, and what I want to show you is how an artist can evolve throughout their work and still kind of have the same nod to their personal style. So the first image that we're going to look at is a composition that he did using thick, bold black lines, and then figuring out which he's going to fill with a color, the yellow, the red, the blue, or leaving some of the spaces white. Simple in idea. Did a whole series of them. Each painting had a different arrangement, different color scheme. Most of the time he was using the reds, the yellows, and the blues. And then eventually, I'll show you the next slide, he started to change his color scheme just a little bit. So as opposed to the first color scheme, which just used the primaries, in this you can see that the color starts to get a little bit more sophisticated. He's still kind of working within those yellows and blues and reds, but he's toning them down now. So he's almost kind of created almost like a pastel tint of blue and a pink color. So he's taking the red, mixing it with white, and then the yellow is not as vibrant as it was before. The structure of the squares and the rectangles has changed as well. They're much more condensed now, and they're filling in, and the lines are starting to break down. He's not using the strong lines that he used in the first image. They start to break down around the corners or fade or start to smudge into one another. So you can see kind of the progression from the first image where he's using the rectangles. They're very clearly defined, using a very small color scheme. Move into the second image, still using line work here, but the lines are starting to be a little bit more sophisticated, started to break down in certain areas, create more interest in the image, and the color scheme is getting a little bit more interesting too. Gone are the simplistic primary colors and kind of going into working with the tints of each color. And then the third Mondrian, which you can see is very different than the rectangle images that we just looked at. But you can kind of get an idea from that last image of how this one came to be. It's almost as if he took that graph and started to pull those lines up and down to create the curves of the tree. This abstraction didn't just come out of nowhere. It kind of grew from all of the previous work that he did. But he's still segmenting space in this one. If you look around the tree branches, each section kind of has its own little area, very reminiscent to the first one where each space has its own color. In this one, each kind of section of branch has its own little value inside of it, and even though the values change, you still have this very sectioned feeling for each space. I just wanted you to see how an artist can start in one spot and have a progression, change over time, but still feels always like the same. So just like you're going to do, you're going to create line work, and even though you're trying different things, your line work is going to be very unique to you. And that line work can stay the same for a while, but it can also change over time. But it's always going to be yours, and it's always going to be the way you do things and the way you make marks. So as your line work, as you grow, your line work's going to get more sophisticated. But you need to start somewhere. So with this, the next project we're going to be working on, it's really for you to learn how to control your line work, how to create your line work, and the different types of marks and line that you can create.